start by situating myself in the work. So Jasmine Rose and Rice Pyongyats, Ganyenge Haga Iwako Matsoda, Ganyenge Haga Riansta, which means my name is Jasmine. I'm of the Mohawk Nation and I'm learning Ganyenge, the Mohawk language. This is some imagery of my roots, my family, and where I come from. My dad was born and raised in Ganawage, and my mom is a settler with Italian and French-Canadian ancestry. I grew up in Burlington, Ontario, which is about an hour away from here, and about 6 hours from Ganawage, my home community. So I situate myself as an urban Indigenous person with some connection and some disconnection from my Indigenous side. But I was also very fortunate to grow up in close proximity to Six Nations of the Grand River, which has been really helpful with my language learning journey, and I'll actually be attending Six Nations Polytechnic in the fall to continue learning Ganyungeha. To frame my analysis, I draw from two different theoretical frameworks, both that center language reclamation, and I'll start with Leonard 2023, which contrasts language reclamation from more commonly known language revitalization. So language revitalization focuses on improving the health of a language, which usually includes increasing the number of speakers that speak the language and to get them to be as proficient as possible, as quickly as possible. However, this can sometimes open the door for extractivism, because that means that just anybody could go and learn the language and it may not be meaningful to them. They might not necessarily have ties to the community or the nation, like what happens with the character Steve. Whereas language reclamation focuses on the health of communities and on the individuals within the community, and sees language learning as like a holistic opportunity to increase general wellness. So in practice, that can look like very, very different. So forgive my rough drawings, but on the left you can see some ideas that I jotted down of these types of differences. So with revitalization, it might look like speaker recordings, creating resources, attending immersion schools or online learning, so things that really focus on language improvement, proficiency improvement. Whereas language reclamation practices have a lot more focus on the community or nation and individual cultural identities. So it could look like things like spirituality and prayer, community socials, cultural teachings, learning about nationhood, self-discovery, etc. And I really liked this quote from Shuist and Pedraspade, who summarize it quite neatly. Within language revitalization discourse, the problem is language endangerment and loss, but within reclamation practice, the problem is colonialism. The second framework I draw from comes from Chickasaw scholar Kari Chu, whose framework centers around the practice of finger weaving, or tani in her language, as a metaphor for language reclamation. So this framework was developed through discussion with her community members on what their language reclamation journeys looked like, and it synthesized three different main ideas that took place that are woven together to create the language reclamation process. So before I dive into what those three strands are and how they relate to the novel, I'll do a very brief synopsis. And as you'll see, language is probably not one of the top themes you would choose for this novel, given what takes place for the characters. So the story follows the protagonist Alice and her struggle to adapt to her new life with her white professor husband Steve and her 6-week-old infant daughter Dawn. The transition to motherhood has been made especially difficult for Alice because of the recent loss of her own mother, the move from her community, Six Nations of the Grand River, and her relatives. She also navigates postpartum mental illness and faces racism in her new Toronto community, especially in her husband's academic sphere. And at the peak of her struggles, the narrator, spoiler alert, shifts to Alice's future granddaughter Eden, about 50 years in the future. And through Eden's narrative, we learn about the life that Alice goes on to live, or other potential lives, and the woman that she becomes, which notably includes returning to her community and reclaiming her language and cultural identity. So going back to the Tani framework, the three strands, the first is the development of a critical Chickasaw consciousness, which involves acknowledging the legacies of colonization as forces that undermine the goals of language reclamation. So these colonial forces can take many different shapes, but one way that I really saw it coming up in And Then She Fell is through Alice's invalidation of her own identity because of her sense of shame surrounding her lack of language knowledge. So I pulled this quote from Kim Anderson's, Kim Anderson? Thank you, yes. We have internalized the belief that we are less native because we can't measure up to some quintessential native experience whereby we grow up on land, speak our language, and are well-versed from an early age in native ways. This was something that really resonated with me as, again, somebody half white, somebody that did not grow up in my community and didn't grow up with the language and is learning as an adult. And it's something, again, that I really saw showing up with Alice and her persistent feelings of shame. I would argue shame is one of the biggest themes in the book. Alice faces a tremendous amount of assimilatory pressures that make her feel shameful for how she doesn't live up to those expectations, including the way she dresses, the food she prepares, her capacity for mothering, her writing and storytelling ability, but notably for this context, the lack of knowledge. However, we find out later on in Alice's life that she ends up teaching her daughter and granddaughter songs in Ganyangeha and moves back to Six Nations. She returns to ceremony and finds confidence in her storytelling. So while the language reclamation process isn't necessarily described, we come to know that it has taken place. And one way that I thought this was really neatly represented was through the chapter numbers in the book. So I'll pass it around. I have a couple of tags so you can see visually, but in the beginning of the story, the numbers, chapter numbers, are just represented numerically, 1, 2, 3, etc. And then later on in the story, once the narrator has shifted and we know that this reclamation has taken place, the chapter numbers are written in Ganyangeha, so Asin Degani, which means 1, 2, etc. The second strand in the Tani framework is Chickasaw as cultural practice. Chickasaw is the Chickasaw language. So in Kari Chu's study, one excerpt that really stood out to me came from a participant that referenced a situation where they were at a social or gathering, and they went to serve an elder a plate of food, as was custom, and the elder was speaking fluently in their language, and thanked the participant for the food, and the participant was able to say "you're welcome" in the language. And the participant had reflected upon how they knew none of the language other than very some basic greetings and pleasantries such as hello, thank you, etc. And that they had no idea what the elder was saying when the plate of food was delivered, but this simple thank you, you're welcome interaction was really, really meaningful to them and made them feel as though they belonged in the community. So this was representative of using the language as cultural practice, where it's not just a tool for communication, but also a form of cultural expression. So Chu says that it encompasses oral tradition as a total communicative framework, inclusive of song, prayer, teachings, ritual performances, religious ceremonies, and other cultural institutions. I thought this showed up so beautifully in And Then She Fell in a couple of different moments. The first was when Alice encounters a spirit being who's speaking fluently in Ganyangeha, and she doesn't know what the spirit is saying. But she narrates at this point, I freeze. I don't know a lot of Mohawk, but everyone from Six Nations knows that first word, hello. Sego, I answer without hesitation. And this part really stood out to me when she said everyone from Six Nations knows that first word, because she is from Six Nations. So it's kind of this way of indirectly affirming her identity and her sense of belonging in her community. And it was also something I related to because those small exchanges of pleasantries are something that I've always experienced visiting Ganawage, and anytime, going to a store or something, saying thank you, goodbye, and in the language is really common and something that I really enjoy about visiting. The second example is when Alice purchases a handmade dream catcher from a man who's selling crafts on the street, and I guess looked visibly Indigenous, because when she made the purchase she said "Nyawa," thank you, in her language, and he said "Nyawa," which means welcome. And Alice reflected, something about this small exchange feels like validation, like acceptance. We may be from totally different circumstances, but we're still a team. We both know what we're up against here, and we're surviving. After all, how many times is Mohawk even spoken on these lands today? I found this to be really powerful. Again, all that was said was thank you and you're welcome, but it has this very significant greater meaning that to me is perfectly encompasses language reclamation, because there is not a great degree of proficiency or supporting the health of the language that's taking place here, but it's so very meaningful to Alice to be able to use the language in that way. The third strand is revaluing language learners. So this strand in the Tawny framework resists the view that language imperfection and errors, which are inevitable parts of the language learning journey, do not add value toward proper revitalization or language sustenance goals. So what this refers to is the pressure that a lot of Indigenous language learners might feel to get the language exactly right, since through language revitalization frameworks, there's often this sense of urgency to maintain the language in its purest possible form, and that can put a tremendous amount of pressure on learners who then might find it too intimidating to even try. Like, if you can't get it perfectly, then what's even the point kind of mentality. So it also resists the idea that as an Indigenous person, one should already know their language. By acknowledging that language learners are very, very important, it kind of, in my opinion, resists against the sort of imaginary Indian trope where Indigenous people just already know it inherently, or the assumptions that, you know, even if you did grow up in your community, that you might grow up to be a fluent speaker or had access to fluent speakers throughout your life. So in the revaluation of language learners, it recognizes that learners are essential components of language revitalization efforts, which is important, but also not necessarily the most important aspect of language learning. It offers important benefits beyond this, including to the individual. In And Then She Fell, Alice's husband, Steve, the white professor, learns Mohawk, possibly for his career, possibly to pass on to their daughter, it's not quite clear. But he picks it up really, really quickly, which is something that really bothers Alice. It just irks her every time he speaks it, even though in her mind it might be like a nice thing to do, and she's glad that her daughter will hear it. But it's this juxtaposition in her mind and this tension that she's experiencing. She reflects, Steve didn't need to question his identity and worth every time he said a Mohawk word. His voice didn't shake when he spoke, scared any mispronunciation would signal to everybody that he didn't really belong. This really stood out to me as falling under the strand of revaluing language learners, because here Alice is talking about the pressures to get it right and the pressures of what it means if she does mispronounce something in Mohawk, that it could mean that she's not a real Mohawk, that she doesn't belong. And Steve doesn't face those pressures. To Steve, it's just another language, and if he makes a big deal, big whoop. But to Alice, there's this very significant greater meaning that she hasn't yet come to accept at this point in the story. However, later on, she's at a dinner with Steve and some of his academic colleagues, and I would say that at this point she's getting closer to the development of the critical consciousness that I referred to in the first strand. The colleagues are talking about a piece of Pauline Johnson's work. I can't remember which one specifically, and Alice wasn't familiar with it. So she told them that she wasn't sure when they had asked her a question about it. And she thought, I'm not sure, I say, painfully aware, as academics always make me, that knowledge is a privilege, a currency even, especially knowledge of my own people. They like for me to know they're rich in knowledge that should be mine. So I really thought this was almost Alice forgiving herself in a way for not knowing the Pauline Johnson quote, whereas earlier in the story she's punishing to herself a little bit for not knowing Mohawk, for not knowing some of the traditional knowledge that she feels she should know, or not having the storytelling capacities that she feels she should have. So why does this matter, and what is the bigger picture? I argue that Indigenous literatures can serve as models for language reclamation for Indigenous readers like myself. It was so validating to read Alice's experiences of shame surrounding her lack of language and or traditional knowledge, as I'm sure was the experience for many other readers. It also was just so nice. I listened to the audiobook as I read, and it was so nice to hear the language. So really appreciated that. These kinds of novels can also demonstrate complexities pertaining to cultural identity and call to justice for non-Indigenous readers. Again, resisting against imaginary and vanishing Indian tropes. These novels exemplify to readers the very complex experiences of language learning and show that it's not always this linear journey. It shows that not all Indigenous people have access to fluent speakers or grow up with the language, regardless of whether or not they grow up in community. And I feel like that's really important. So I will close off with a plug for the Indigenous Literatures Lab, which you probably are getting sick of hearing about us by now, but that's us, and I'm delighted to have a few of the lab members in the room with me. We read this novel as part of the lab's book club. Was it the spring session, I think? It was one of the books that we read in our seasonal book club, which was a really fantastic opportunity for both our lab and OISE community members to engage with the text and talk about these kinds of themes. So our work is to uplift Indigenous voices, continue contributing to that resurgence, and generate conversation and resources for bringing Indigenous literatures into the classroom. But it also has indirectly created space for Indigenous students to explore these themes through the safety of literature. Again, reflecting a lot about my own experience, having read the book, and having this reckoning about my own cultural identity in the past decade or two. It was really, really nice to be able to talk about these themes and read about these themes in a way that maybe felt a bit safer to hear through Alice's perspective. So I have a QR code to our website that has links to all of our events, including one this evening if you're able to join us with Dr. Joaquin Munoz and Dr. Amy Farrell. We'll be talking about contemporary storytelling in the YA Indigenous literature context. I also have a link to our Instagram, which will have similar information. So, Nyong'o, thank you so much.